Story 1. As early as I can remember, I thought, wait, you all don't even like each other. What are we doing here? Maybe 5 years old. Story 2. Pretty much my whole childhood, I never understood children being traumatized by their parents getting divorced. It sounded like a dream come true to me. They finally divorced when I was 27 and no longer lived with them, but nothing changed other than them moving to separate residences. They continued to spend all their time together until my father died. Story 3. One Saturday evening in winter, because it was dark early, when I was 6 or 7, I asked my mother what it was called when people are no longer married. Divorce. Yeah. Why don't you and Dad get a divorce? Story 4. Honestly, my mom was a huge instigator and picked fights with my dad for no reason. I wish he would divorce her. When we were younger, my siblings and I agreed we would choose Dad in the divorce. Story 5. As early as I can remember, I had complex thoughts. I read a lot, watched many TV shows and movies, and saw happy couples and families portrayed. I knew it was nothing like that because I never saw any affection or kindness between my parents. Around first or second grade, I felt envious of kids with divorced parents. But I knew that would never be me because my dad was financially dependent on my mom. As much as he clearly hated her, he was not going anywhere. Maybe 2 years later, I realized it was actually financial abuse and control. He didn't work, cashed her checks while she was working, and withheld her money except for a tiny amount for groceries, although I didn't know that term yet. Story 6. One of my earliest memories, around 3 to 5 years old, is waking up in the middle of the night because I was thirsty and wanted a glass of water. I went into the kitchen, and my mom and dad were still awake, which was nice since I needed their help. However, they were arguing and did not stop when I came into the kitchen. I was taught to wait my turn to speak, so I waited for one of them to stop talking, but they did not. Even when one finished speaking, the other immediately continued their argument. They never acknowledged me. I went to bed thirsty. That was one of my earliest memories. Story 7. Probably when I was 13, he was hitting my mother, and I grabbed a knife and told him to stop hitting her. Otherwise, I was going to stab him. While saying that, I thought I would probably go to prison for killing him. I also thought that if I went to prison, it would be worth it and I would accept my fate. He stopped hitting her. However, she did not finally leave him until the day after I moved out at 17. Story 8. Honestly, I felt like that, but then realized they are both just unhappy and overall miserable people. So, them being miserable together is probably the best they will ever experience in their lives. Thankfully, I do not speak to them anymore, and my life is much happier because I have seen how miserable life can get. Story 9. They felt like they were protecting me from trauma and stigma by staying together, but the tension became too much for me when I was 12. Nevertheless, they stayed together until my younger brother turned 18, which simplified the paperwork significantly. By that point, they could not stand being in the same room together anymore. Story 10, about 7, I think. The first time the police got involved was because my sibling ran away. My parents are still together to this day, but not a time goes by when I see them that my dad doesn't insult her in some way. Mom always just laughs it off and says that's how he is. No, Mom, he doesn't actually respect you. He never has. Story 11. I was very young. I wrote in my journal that I wanted my parents to get a divorce. My mother found it while looking and was angry. Maybe do not be so harsh to everyone all the time. Story 12. I was 8 years old, huddled under the porch with my sisters and our German Shepherd puppy, swearing we would never go back into the house. My father was taking an axe and destroying everything inside. He had done about $40,000 of work on a boat, which was locked in the barn. He had expressly told my mother that under no circumstances was she to let the owner take the boat, as he was infamous for stiffing laborers. Despite this, she opened the barn and let him take the boat. Editor's note: $40,000 in 1976 is approximately the equivalent of $226,000 in 2025. Story 13. When their loud fights were heard by everyone in the apartment complex, I would shrink and shrivel in embarrassment as an elementary school child. Story 14. Since I can remember, They only got divorced because when I was 12 or 13, I told my mom when she came with the same speech, "I'm going to divorce your dad someday because I can't take this anymore." I told her to just do it already because my siblings and I, couldn't take it anymore. It still took her another year to finally do it. Story 15. I was about 3 years old and was playing with the neighbor in her front yard when we heard the sound of my parents fighting coming from my house. I can't remember the exact words, but basically she asked me what was going on. I was casual about it because it was normal to me, and she explained that actually, no, that was not normal at all. Now, this next part one don't actually remember, but my dad likes to bring it up whenever the topic of the divorce comes up. Apparently, my parents were just talking when I ran between them and declared, "You two quit fighting." According to my father, that is the one and only reason he left the house and the divorce happened. However, my mom's religion only allowed divorce under circumstances of proven adultery. So, my dad was a cheater plus an abusive alcoholic with other major flaws. But he blames 3-year-old me for his first divorce like clockwork. Story 16. When my dad dragged us out of our beds at 1 a.m. to scream and abuse us because the toilet paper roll was not properly situated on the spindle. He screamed so much that spit flew out of his mouth. My mom just sobbed on the bed because he had frightened her so badly she was in a daze. I just wanted it to stop. It finally did years later, but not soon enough in my opinion. Story 17. My parents argued every Saturday night after my father came home drunk from drinking all day. I must have been around 10 years old when I wished they would just get a divorce. Story 18. I remember vividly waking up in the middle of the night as a small child and wandering into the living room where my mother was sitting in the dark, listening to John Denver's "Leaving on a Jet Plane" on repeat. I sat with her for what felt like hours. I was too small to really understand why, but I knew she was sad. She was a deeply flawed person, and I no longer have any contact with her. Even then, I knew something was wrong and that we would all be better apart. Story 19. I was always scared of them divorcing when I was little because my mother used it against my father. She would frequently move out and disappear for a few days only to come back. But as an adult, seeing how miserable and codependent they are, I wish someone had just gone through with it. Story 20. I was 6 and sitting on the stairs. There was a full wall between me and my parents as they screamed at each other. Yes, right then. Story 21. Age-wise, early teens, probably a bit before. My dad was an alcoholic and spent more time in bars than at home. He slept on the couch rather than in their bedroom. They didn't seem to get along, but my mom was an enabler. He cheated on her a lot, even bringing one woman home to play a board game with us. They never divorced but separated for a few years. I was in my 30s and out of the house by then. Story 22. Probably sometime in middle school when my mother kept saying she wanted to divorce my father but couldn't until I went to college. This also wasn't their first time, as they had married and divorced previously but were still sleeping together when I was conceived. He is an awful alcoholic and very verbally and emotionally abusive to both of us. I was thrilled to go to college because that meant I never had to speak to him again. Then my mother didn't leave him for 5 years. During my first term at college, my mother started using alcohol to cope with me being out of the house, so when I came home for winter break, I had 2 alcoholic parents. I slowly started realizing that my mother is her own kind of terrible person, and I stopped talking to her about 3 years ago. Despite all this, I was excited and a little happy for my mother when I heard she finally filed the papers, though I was deeply skeptical at first because she had threatened it so many times. Story 23. When I had to be the most responsible person in the house by letting them know that the yelling back and forth was keeping us kids awake past our bedtime, and we had school the next day. Story 24. When my dad threatened to kill me because he accused me of knowing about my mom's affair, I was only trying to hold it together through high school. Good times. Story 25. My mom and stepdad were not great people and were really toxic together. I remember being 5 and wishing I did not have to live with them. They divorced that year, and things were turbulent for a few years as my mom bounced from marriage to marriage with my ex-stepdad stalking her the whole time. When I was 11, he took advantage of her being depressed because my grandparents had died, so he just moved back in, claiming he wanted to be there for us. They got remarried a few months later, and my 12-year-old self protested by wearing black to the courthouse wedding. They were just as toxic as before, probably worse, and stayed that way until my mom died. Story 26. I was always confused about why divorce was portrayed as something sad and difficult in children's books and television. Wouldn't you run out and celebrate? I always hated and feared my alcoholic dad and wished my mom would divorce him. When she finally did, I was in 5th grade or so, and it was such a relief to have him gone. Story 27. I didn't know it was an option. I wished he would just go away as he hurt us. I just wanted him to go away. But it was the 80s, and as a 5-year-old, I watched a friend go through it and said to my mother, "I hope you and Daddy never get divorced." I would love to go back in time to that moment and tell my younger self, "They are going to, and it's messy." So I got my wish at 10 and he died 8 years ago now. Story 28. Probably around when I was in 3rd grade. He would physically abuse me, and if my mother was home to see it and told him to stop, he would try to do the same to her. It was also becoming increasingly clear that my mother's family did not like him. My grandmother said that my mother probably stayed with him because she was afraid he would kidnap my brother and me and take us several states away. However, even after we were fully grown, she stayed with him, so who knows? Story 29. I thought about it once I became a teenager and started to realize that the way they treated each other was not normal. I began expressing my thoughts once I was old enough to not care about the consequences. They are still married to this day. Story 30. I must have been about 8. They had such a roller coaster relationship. It was like watching 2 teenagers fall in and out of love with each other 100 times. It was exhausting and ridiculous. This is what happens when 2 emotionally immature individuals get married with children. Story 31. When I was 4, I had a school dance recital. My parents came to watch but started loudly fighting, yelling and screaming at each other in a primary school hall filled with children aged 3 to 7. My best friend, whose parents were divorced, turned to me and told me I should get a stepmother. To this day, my parents are married but have not attended a school event together since. My high school graduation is in September, and I am very nervous. Story 32. I have no memory of ever wanting them together. My first memory of active desire for them to divorce was when I was 6. Separately, I guess they were fine. Dad was an outgoing party guy in the Navy, and she was repressed and socially awkward. It was miserable being their only child. He stopped by my house when I was pregnant with my son. I asked him to divorce her, treat the settlement fairly, and bring her to me. He said he loved her. They put the cooperation and dysfunction in codependency. Story 33. In my teens, I realized my narcissistic father, who had the emotional intelligence of a 5-year-old, was not a normal father but an abusive alcoholic. To escape the daily drama, my younger brother and I used to urge our mother to divorce him. I am now in my 40s and have come to the conclusion that they were made for each other. I have recognized that my mother is a people pleaser with the emotional intelligence of a 5-year-old and a nag. Story 34. A screaming match so loud that it could be heard half a kilometer away from the house. The windows were closed. Story 35. My mom was holding my baby brother while fighting with my dad and telling him to leave the house. They were screaming loudly at each other. My brother started crying. My dad tried to pull him out of my mom's arms, and they tugged him back and forth. He said he wasn't leaving without his son. Eventually, my dad let go and stormed out. I was probably 3 or 4 years old at this time. I didn't know what divorce was, naturally, but I remember desperately wanting things to be okay. Story 36. We went on a family road trip when I was 15. They started fighting on the way out of the driveway and did not stop the whole trip. My mom kept pointing out places we were passing and saying, "Maybe I will live there after I divorce your dad." I kept thinking, why do not you go ahead and do that then? I still have scars on my face from the stress acne I got on that trip. Story 37. I never had one specific moment that I can remember. I just always remember my parents being unhappy. Divorce was extremely common in military families, and I wondered why my parents did not do that. I also understood because we lived overseas and it seemed like a logistical nightmare. Seeing other kids going through that helped me understand for sure. Story 38. Probably the whole time, like others have said, but it was not until I was 16 or so that I started actively asking my mother why she was still with my father, why she did not divorce him, and tried to convince her that we would all be better off if they divorced. Spoiler alert, we were. Story 39. At 7 years old, I noticed their relationship was not genuine. They divorced while I was in the 11th or 12th grade, and I was relieved they finally completed it. My sister, on the other hand, was upset and shocked. Story 40. When the verbal abuse and neglect escalated to physical violence, instead of hitting his wife, he would hit us children. My mother once used me as a body shield. Although my mother was a flawed person, she was definitely the lesser of two evils. I was elated when I found out we were sneaking off one day when he left for work. Story 41. It was more, why won't you see what he is doing and leave him? But it was when he first hit me. He slammed a fist down over the top of my head. I was 7 years old. They had been married for maybe 6 months to 1 year. That was after she was unhappy because he kept isolating us, took all of her money, and would not let us have enough food. It has been 25 years since she married him, and he only got worse, but she is still with him to this day. Story 42. I do not know how old I was. They divorced when I was 3. However, I have a distinct memory of getting up and closing the living room door so I could hear Thomas the Tank Engine instead of them fighting. Story 43. When my parents did not communicate about who was going to pick me up from school, and both showed up, they started verbally fighting on the playground. Then my dad was mad because my mom was wearing his sweatshirt, so he asked for it back. My mom took it off and threw it at him, revealing that she was in her bra. Then my father became physical, which was common in our household since he had been taken from our house to jail for domestic violence years prior. School staff had to intervene. I was so humiliated. My parents are still legally married, although my mom is single and my dad lives across the country with his girlfriend. Story 44. During the COVID pandemic, screaming matches happened almost every day. We went to my grandparents' place once but came back. Now, my father still yells a lot, but thankfully I am only home during vacations from college, so life is pretty calm. My father is a good person. He just loses his temper very easily because he is constantly stressed. Story 45. I remember the exact moment. I was in 5th grade right before winter holiday break. My parents sat me down to reassure me they would never get divorced. I rolled my eyes, and they pretended not to notice. Took 8 years for them to go back on their word, and it has now been 10 years since they initiated the process with no end in sight. Story 46. Years after their divorce. It was difficult when it happened, but later I realized it was probably the best decision because they were not going to fix it. My father went on to have a second marriage that was far more dysfunctional than the first. He was not fixable. Story 47. When they told me they were going to divorce after months of screaming and fighting, they didn't think it would wake me up, but it did. Now they are too old to start over and say they are comfortable, deliberately not mentioning things to each other to maintain forced harmony. Please don't stay together for the sake of the children. Story 48. Unfortunately, it did not occur to me until I moved out on my own. I was raised in a very strict religious environment, and divorce was absolutely taboo. I am still unpacking how difficult it was. Story 49. Maybe when my mother started telling me every day that I was an unpleasant person just like my father, but was too afraid of him to say it to his face. Story 50. When I was 9 or 10, a classmate came over after school to play and have dinner. She asked me what time my father came home. My mother was a stay-at-home parent. I paused because I didn't know. He didn't really come home often. He lived in a different house. I suddenly realized that my parents were not in a good marriage. However, they did not divorce until I was in high school. Story 51. My parents fought a lot and often screamed and got physical with each other. My brother and I would stand with our ears against our bedroom doors, listening to make sure the yelling and throwing would not escalate into beatings. When it did, we would run in and separate them. Afterwards, both of them would be adamant that their marriage was over and that they were going to divorce. They would say that it was serious this time. It never was. The moment those threats stopped scaring me was when I started wishing they would just do it. Felt like a false promise after that point. Story 52. I was 11 when my parents separated. My mother took me to a therapist. I remember him asking how I felt about everything, and I said I was glad not to hear them fight anymore. Story 53. I do not remember the first time I had that thought, but I remember basically doing a happy dance when they finally divorced. Story 54. I'm not sure exactly when, but I remember noticing more often how toxic and unhappy their marriage is. Mostly, I want them to separate for my mother's sake because she is the sweetest person ever, and my father is a toxic man-child who is emotionally constipated. She is miserable with him but refuses to leave him for religious reasons. Story 55. Literally, my entire life this has been my greatest wish for 46 years. I have begged them over and over. My siblings are estranged and schizophrenic, hospitalized and diagnosed. They are sad and still married, still toxic. I left home at 13 and do not regret it. It has been the most destructive thing in my life. Story 56. I was extremely traumatized by my parents' divorce as a child. It was not until I was an adult that I realized it was the best decision they ever made. If we had stayed together as a family, I would have been more negatively affected than I was. Story 57. When they constantly talk about it but never follow through, it creates years of emotional roller coaster that still continues today as an adult. They claim they are serious this time, but they are not. I have heard this for 20 years. Story 58. Different perspective. My parents argued a lot for 1 to 2 years when I was a child. My brother even suggested they should divorce. 25 years later, they are one of the happiest couples I know. I remember my childhood as a pretty happy one and have no trauma from multiple homes, new partners, or step-siblings. Sometimes divorce is better. Sometimes it is not. Story 59. Probably around 7 or 8. One was present and kind, the other was not. As soon as I understood what divorce was, I knew they needed it. Story 60. 10 or 11, maybe. I started asking my mother to divorce my father when I was 12. She finally did when I was 16, but had no patience for how upset I already was. Frustrating. Story 61. I was the youngest. I never saw my parents interact in a healthy manner, but I did not know this. I just thought that was how life was and that all families were awful behind closed doors. Story 62. God, I wish they would just do it already. 32 years and still together. Growing up, they often treated me as their therapist and would badmouth each other to me privately. Car rides or family discussions would turn into aggressive battles. I was scared it might turn into physical aggression, never did, but it was scary for young ones, especially when they fought during car rides. Times I was just done with their behavior. It warped my idea of relationships for a long time. Now that I am married and away, they barely speak to each other. I wish they had separated a long time ago. Maybe they would have found happier relationships. Story 63. I was around 8 years old. My mom was lying on the couch crying. I remember trying to console her, telling her to just say sorry to Dad, and she berated me instead. It was obviously hurtful, as I remember 40 years later what she was wearing and the couch she was lying on. They fought all the time. I was around 12 when I stopped wishing they would get along and instead hoped they would divorce. They stayed married until my dad died, so about 40 years. Now my mom has nothing nice to say about my dad. And all these secrets about him are coming out while she is dating a new partner who is perfect and in it for her estate. We all think. I can't help but feel angry. No thought to the kids and how we felt all those years, just themselves. Also, it is not fair to my deceased dad if mom's stories are even true. There was no physical violence to my knowledge. If Dad was such a closeted piece of trash, why didn't she ever tell us? They absolutely should have divorced. But it hurts to see my mom changing the narrative after my dad is gone, and how the family dynamics have changed dramatically since her money-hungry, unemployed boyfriend has entered the picture. Story 64. Honestly, when I was about 8 years old, I realized the only time I did not feel anxious was when I was with my uncle or grandparents. I begged my mother to leave my father because he always screamed at me and threatened me. They have both improved since then, but it does not undo what happened in the past. I am still processing it all in therapy. Story 65. I knew when I was about 10 that they were unhappy and headed for a divorce. They did not separate until I was 12 or 13, and by then it was a relief because my father was abusive. Story 66. I think back to middle school when I told my mother that it was okay if she divorced my verbally abusive father. She cried and told me that I should not say things like that. She is still with him, and he is still very unkind to her. I stand by what I said. Story 67. Probably sometime in elementary school. They never separated and are still together today. My mother still calls me to complain about how miserable she is. Story 68. Adulthood. Mid-20s. A little earlier, they put up a good enough front for an oblivious child. Then I moved out of college, and I realized how much they disliked and hated each other after college when I actually saw them. They were just miserable, and it had become fairly open hostility by that point. I got past the sad part pretty quickly, as they stayed in that horrible situation for way too long because divorce was apparently the end of the world. It was just miserable to visit them. So much questioning of why. They stuck it out against my individual advice to each of them, that I would prefer it for their own sake to be happier alone than like this. They are considerably better now, but it's against all odds, against all good sense in my opinion, and at great personal cost to them. A big objection to divorce was not wanting to pay a lawyer 1/3 of their retirement in the process, and they couldn't agree on anything on their own. The stress and fighting probably took about 5 years off the top for both of them. They aged quickly during those years. Story 69. I can't remember a time I didn't feel that way, but I wished it more when I realized they were happier and nicer when they were not together. If one went out of town for a day or two, things at home were happier. Story 70. I thought about it when I was a young child, but then it became my normality. I wished for a television-style family but thought that was just a fantasy. I did not really think about it again until I was much older in my first serious relationship and realized I did not know what a normal, healthy relationship looked like. I still think constantly that my parents should separate. They are still married. It feels so relieving to be out in my own home now. Story 71. I think when I was 5 years old, my mother almost left my father. We even left the house with our clothes and everything. I remember before that, seeing him hitting her. Story 72. When I was around 8, I realized that they hated each other. They never fought in front of us, but it did not matter because children are perceptive. I spent 2 years walking on eggshells in the tension they created before they finally separated. I am 43 and still get anxious if I hear someone moving around the house after I am in bed. Story 73. Not gonna lie, I did not realize it until after they had already split up. It was only a couple of years later that I realized they should have split a long time before. I blame purity culture, evangelicalism, naivety, and a lack of communication. Story 74. Maybe around 5 or 6. There's no divorce in my country, but at that time I didn't want them to be together. I only remember my mom accusing my dad of having an affair with his boss. He denied it but told her that if he did, it was because time had left my mom behind and she couldn't keep up with him. My mom kept yelling, "What are you proud of, these?" Then she started throwing my father's plaques and trophies on the ground, at him, and onto the glass center table, shattering it. There was more yelling. She started pushing my dad out of the door. He resisted, so she pinched him with the door. I'm pretty sure they had other fights before and many after, but this one I never forget. After every fight, they would tell me separately why they fought, their regrets and issues with each other. Story 75. I don't remember when the first time was, but I know the first time I can recall. I am certain it was not the first time I had the thought. I was 17, we were at a restaurant, and in anger, my dad told me that I was the reason they were on the verge of divorce. I remember a part of me wishing they just would. I thought about how my mom and I could get along without constantly worrying about his ego. Story 76. I never knew a day when my parents did not hate each other. My earliest memory was somewhere between 5 and 7 years old, and my mother stormed out during our lunch on vacation and disappeared. We cried all day, thinking she had left us for good. By the time we were in high school, trying to study while our parents fought, we would yell at them to get a divorce. They finally divorced when I was in college. In their minds, they stayed together for us, but it was not the right decision. Story 77. I think around 12 was the first time I really noticed how much they do not like each other. I have talked to both my parents many times about how they would be much happier apart, but they have refused to actually look at their marriage. They just celebrated 38 years last week, and instead of going on the camping trip they had planned, they got in a fight that lasted several days. Story 78. They constantly yelled at each other, and my mother cried every day. This was early in my childhood, but I cannot remember the exact first incident. Story 79. I begged my mother to get a divorce since I was about 5 years old, after I learned about divorce. They are still together but still arguing and cannot talk to each other normally. I was always jealous of children with divorced parents and did not understand why divorce would traumatize them. I still believe the trauma comes from life before the divorce, not the divorce itself. Story 80. Not totally answering the question, but my parents had a very unhappy marriage purely out of convenience, and it did not last very long. They were young and had 3 children 3 years in a row, and the stress affected them besides generally being incompatible. They divorced when I was 9, and my mother remarried her soulmate, an absolute gem of a man who was an amazing partner to her and stepfather to us. They had a son together, and the difference in quality of childhood when you grow up in a happy home compared to one full of angry, unhappy parents is vast. I love my younger brother dearly, but he had such an advantageous start in life compared to what my 2 other siblings and I had. Parents who stay in an unhappy marriage for the children are not necessarily doing them the service they think they are. Story 81. Oh man, I used to tell my mom to leave a lot. When I was 15 years old, I remember just sitting by the fire, listening to my dad say we would all be homeless if he wanted to kick us out. He would keep the house and we would have nothing. I thought, okay then, forget it, let's go. Story 82. They argued all the time. My sibling and I walked on eggshells for years. I could never hear what my mother was saying due to her pitch and tone, but I could hear my father, and he said awful things to her. The day my mother called us into the home office to tell us she was filing for divorce was one of the best days of my life. I am forever happy they divorced. My father stayed awful, remarried a horrible woman even worse than him, and has now passed away. I am no contact with her. My mother remarried a wonderful man who was my father for all intents and purposes, and because of him, I have had a happier life. Story 83. I do not think I fully realized I felt that way until after it was done. I just remember putting my head under a pillow whenever they started shouting at each other and feeling a sense of dread. Story 84. My parents were once in such a difficult situation that they lived separately. One time I was at my mother's, and she told me they might get a divorce and asked how I would feel about it. I lit up and said it would be a great idea. I was so excited. I was literally making plans, hoping that on the days my father had me, my brother would be with my mother. My parents and brother were very toxic and abusive, and I was their punching bag. My mother was shocked and confused by my response. Looking back, I realized she was not serious about a divorce. She was setting me up as a pawn in some sort of scheme to either get back at my father or end the separation so they could live together again. They never divorced. I was 8 at the time. I am now no contact with all of them and happy with the family I have built. Story 85. About as long as I can remember. I do not recall seeing any real affection between them, and looking back I realize how manipulative and emotionally abusive my father was to my mother. Story 86. I never cared about their relationship when I was a child, even less so now that I am an adult. I understand it better now. They are people before they are parents, so it never bothered me. It might be a bleak way of looking at it, and it is because of them that I have it. I am angry with them. They were not good at being parents. Story 87. Dad was abusive in all ways except physical. Mom was his enabler. I was about 7 when I thought a divorce would save us, and my sister and I could live with Mom and never have to see him again. It took a few more years of being mom's therapist before I suggested it. I think I was around 11. She laughed and told me about my half-sister's dad, who was abusive in every way, including physical. Dad is much better than him. I don't want to be alone either, and I wouldn't find anyone else anyway. My brain decided that if Dad ever became physically abusive to one of us, she would finally leave him. I started arguing with him during every one of his tantrums, alcohol-induced rage, ranting about how everyone but him was wrong, throwing wine bottles on the floor, kicking someone out, slamming and breaking doors, and so on. I egged him on for as long as I could handle before breaking down. He never hit us. I still wish he had hit me. Maybe then the police would have listened to me. Story 88. My mom mentioned during a holiday once that they might get divorced soon. I asked them about it when we got home, and my mom told me to be quiet. It took about 3 to 4 years for it to happen, and I thought to myself, took long enough, because they always had arguments or fights. Story 89. When they had to have arguing chairs, as suggested by their marriage counselor in the early 1990s. To keep things from getting physical, their therapist suggested they stay seated across the room from each other anytime they wanted to fight. Now I shudder whenever I see a living room with those fancy high-backed armchairs. Story 90. Frankly, it never even occurred to me. I was 19 when they finally divorced, and I remember thinking that sounds like a good idea. I thought this was just normal life. I mean, who is not on a first-name basis with police and emergency medical services crews because they are at your place so often? That was not everyone's experience. Story 91. When I left for university and left my younger brother, who was 15 at the time, behind, my parents were always at odds. They either forced us through screaming matches at dinner or those very long dinners without a word, but with tension you could cut with a butter knife. It was always difficult to go through, but the thought of my brother experiencing this on his own, without siblings to relate to, was really hard for me. At that point, it reached the stage where I asked them to divorce. Story 92. 6th grade. It is kind of obvious even as a kid when you notice that your mother and father do not share rooms and they barely talk to each other. However, they stayed together despite all the signs saying they should have divorced. They only became separated once my father died of a heart attack. Story 93. Well, after they had divorced, I only ever once wished they would get back together. Even then, just thinking about it felt wrong to me. Story 94. I am 37 and still think my parents should get divorced. They will not. The only way I can explain it to people is that they love each other, but they really do not like each other. Story 95. Children of unhappy marriages. Your mother has tried repeatedly. I can guarantee it is the father who is holding her hostage. Do not listen to the lies. You will regret it when you are older. I know I have. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.